In anticipation of Chapter 5, and specifically Guarma in Red Dead Redemption 2, I have to admit that I was excited and looking forward to a whole new map with new or different terrain and topography, vegetation, wildlife, and a free roam that was unlike any other in the Red Dead franchise. I couldn't wait to see and explore this new world and tropical paradise. I was looking forward to new strangers, random encounters, animals, and mysteries to encounter in this strange and exotic location. I was also expecting there to be at least one small town or settlement on the island that you could spend time in, while being able to interact with its amenities. I thought for sure that in addition to some new mysteries to ponder and try to solve, there would also perhaps be some new wildlife, collectibles, food, weapons, clothing, and cosmetics. Yet in the back of my mind, I had always known that Chapter 5 in Red Dead Redemption 2 had a reputation for being short, and that some people didn't particularly enjoy it. That some people were even disappointed by the Guarma experience in Chapter 5. Nonetheless, I remained optimistic as I finished Chapter 4 and the gang's exciting, yet ultimately failed bank robbery in Saint Denis. However, once Arthur Morgan washed ashore on the tropical island and I played through the first mission, the harsh and blunt reality became quite clear. Guarma was clearly not what I thought it was going to be, nor was it what countless other Red Dead fans and gamers believed it was going to be as well. Chapter 5 in Red Dead Redemption 2, specifically the portion of the chapter which takes place on the tropical island of Guarma, proves to be one of the biggest disappointments in this otherwise open-world masterpiece. What specifically were the biggest problems with Guarma, and why this is the case will be examined. So let's get into it. At the end of Chapter 4, the Vanderlyn gang's attempt to rob the Lemoyne National Bank in Saint Denis was a complete disaster. Prominent gang member Hosea Matthews was murdered in cold blood, while the up-and-coming and well-liked gang member Lenny Summers was also killed. Meanwhile, another prominent gang member, John Marston, was captured and taken into custody, and the boat that Dutch, Arthur, Javier, Bill, and Micah escaped from the city on was shipwrecked due to a storm. The men washed ashore on Guarma, a small sugarcane plantation island in the Caribbean, just off the coast of Cuba. The sugarcane plantation island is ruled by Colonel Alberto Fusar, who presides over an extremely cruel military dictatorship on behalf of Cuba, which administers the island. The Cuban military viciously exploits indentured servants and political prisoners to work in the sugar fields. These workers have been illegally imprisoned against their will and forced into a brutal existence of slave labor. While Fusar became the dictator of Guarma before 1899, a revolt against the brutal Cuban military dictatorship also began, which was led by Hercule Fontaine, seemingly honest and upright Haitian smuggler. Shortly after the gang have washed ashore on the tropical island, they are taken into custody by Cuban soldiers, who are led by an American, Levi Simon, presumably a mercenary who is also the executor and right hand of Colonel Alberto Fusar, who also oversees the island's plantations. But before they can be imprisoned, the Cuban soldiers are ambushed by Hercule Fontaine and his rebels, who enable Arthur and the gang to escape except for Javier, who is wounded and imprisoned by the Cuban military. Upon completing the first mission on the tropical island, the player will then regain full control of Arthur Morgan. And it was at this point that the harsh and blunt reality of Guarma in Red Dead Redemption 2 became clear. There simply is no free roam on the island of Guarma. There is no town or proper settlement. There are no strangers, random encounters, or mysteries. There is only a very small area within the interior of the island that you can explore as Arthur. This small area surrounds a small stream called Arroyo de la Vibora, which leads into a bay called Bahia de la Paz. The explorable area around the small stream is comprised of slight or small shorelines and beaches, with very limited jungle areas. But this explorable area is very small, and the entire explorable area of shorelines, beaches, and jungle around the small stream is surrounded by steep hills and cliffs, which are simply impassable. Now, there is some new wildlife on the island of Guarma, but not very much. In fact, there are 4 new species of birds, including the blue and yellow macaw, the great green macaw, the scarlet macaw, and the red-footed booby. There are also 3 new species of snakes, including the red boa, the rainbow boa, and the sunglow boa, and finally, the green turtle. There are no new predators, and much of the other wildlife on the island can be found in the game's main map. Finally, if you annoy or antagonize Cuban soldiers, or wander outside of the small explorable area around the small stream, the Arroyo de la Vibora, which is in light pink on the map, and wander into an area which is in a darker pink on the map, loads of Cuban soldiers will suddenly spawn, and they will all know exactly where you are, and will almost instantly attack, shooting you through bushes, and when you're not visible to them, they can still somehow see and shoot you. Regardless, Red Dead Redemption 2's management and executive overlords simply did not want us exploring the island. There are only 5 missions which take place on the island of Guarma in Chapter 5. The first mission, when Arthur washes ashore on Guarma and eventually meets up with Dutch and the others, is called Welcome to the New World. Once you've completed the first mission, you regain full control of Arthur and have the freedom to explore the very small area around the small stream called Arroyo de la Vibora. Meanwhile, 2 missions become available during this time, and you're free to choose which one you want to play first. These 2 missions are Savagery Unleashed, somewhat of a side mission, and A Kind and Benevolent Despot, a main story mission. Regardless of which mission you choose to play, you can still freely explore afterwards, but when you start the other mission, you will be locked into playing 5 missions in a row, with no breaks, or regaining control of Arthur, with 3 missions on Guarma and 2 back in the United States. In Welcome to the New World, Haitian smuggler Hercule Fontaine and the rebels rescue Arthur and the gang, as well as rebel leader Leon Fuentes, from the Cuban soldiers on the beach, except for Javier, who was wounded and captured. After they fight off the soldiers, Hercule leads the gang through the jungle, and Leon explains the situation on Guarma to the gang. Fusar is a brutal tyrant, in that the Cuban military ships in people from other islands and forces them into slave labor, working in the sugar plantations, while Fusar enriches himself. Leon also mentions that a group of workers recently escaped into the jungle and need help, as the Cuban military will be after them. Hercule points out Fusar's compound to the gang, which is called Agua Dulce, which also has a processing plant for sugar. He also points out an old abandoned fort called Cinco Torres, which the rebels and Hercule use as a hideout. Dutch asks Hercule if they can trust him, and Hercule affirms that he is the only one who can arrange a boat for the gang's escape. Hercule then maintains that he needs help with the group of workers who escaped. Dutch agrees to help as long as Hercule helps the gang rescue Javier, and Hercule tells Dutch they can meet him at Cinco Torres, the old fort, after they've freed the workers, and that Javier will be in custody at Agua Dulce, Fusar's compound. Hercule also adds that there is a cave below the compound, which they can use to sneak in. Hercule then leads the gang to some very old ruins where they can rest and hide out from the Cuban soldiers. In Savagery Unleashed, Arthur discovers a corpse hanging from a tree in the jungle when he's suddenly struck by a dart which knocks him unconscious. When Arthur awakens, he is bound to a chair and being brutally beaten and interrogated by a rather large and imposing psychopath. Arthur is able to free himself while the sadistic interrogator has his back turned. He then beats the man until he's unconscious. Arthur then frees the other two men who were also bound, one of them being Leon Fuentes, who Arthur previously encountered and met when Hercule and the rebels ambushed the Cuban soldiers on the beach, shortly after Arthur washed ashore on Guarma. As Arthur frees Leon, he mentions to Arthur that he thought he heard voices coming from the church ruins below, as they could be the workers who escaped that Hercule wanted Dutch to help, but have since been apprehended by the Cuban military. Leon and Arthur sneak through the ruins and past several soldiers until they find the three men about to be executed by hanging. But Arthur shoots the ropes, kills the soldier guarding them, as well as all of the other soldiers stationed at the ruins of La Capilla. Arthur, Leon, and the other man he freed after knocking out the sadistic interrogator, Baptiste, free the bound workers. The two men thank Arthur for saving their lives. Leon says goodbye to Arthur and starts to leave with the other workers, while Baptiste confirms that Hercule is arranging a boat for Arthur and the gang to escape Guarma, and that they can find Hercule at Cinco Torres, the abandoned fort. Baptiste also gives Arthur some money, and the two men wish each other well, as Baptiste catches up to Leon and the workers, and Arthur goes his own way. After completing Welcome to the New World and either Savagery Unleashed or A Kind and Benevolent Despot, whichever mission you choose to play, you can still freely explore the small area around the Arroyo de la Vibora. But once you start the next mission, again, whether it's Savagery Unleashed or A Kind and Benevolent Despot, You will be locked into playing the next 5 missions in a row and cannot regain control of Arthur or freely explore. Regardless, after completing Savagery Unleashed, a kind and benevolent despot can be started when you approach Dutch at the waterfall near Fusar's compound. Hercule revealed that there is a cave underneath the compound, which they can use to get inside and rescue Javier. Upon reaching Dutch at the waterfall, a kind and benevolent despot will begin, and Dutch shares that he found the cave Hercule told him about, as well as a guide who can lead them through the cave. As they begin to slowly enter the cave and meet up with the guide, Arthur openly expresses his doubts regarding Dutch's leadership of the gang. Specifically, Arthur cites the disastrous Saint Denis bank robbery in which Hosea and Lenny were killed, and that Dutch's plan to escape Guarma and return to the US, get everyone together, and then make a grand escape is simply not feasible nor realistic. Arthur and Dutch then meet up with Gloria, an elderly woman who will guide them through the cave. But they have to pay her with the last gold bar that Dutch was able to save when the boat they were traveling on in the Caribbean shipwrecked due to a storm. Dutch also begins to express his skepticism regarding John and Abigail, that John was the only one taken alive, while Abigail was able to slip away when Hosea was caught. Their guide, Gloria, meanwhile, is rude and combative, and when they pass through a gate and come to a ladder, she insists on another payment if Dutch and Arthur want to continue. Although she pulls out a knife on Dutch, it's clear that Gloria is a miserable and frail old wretch who poses absolutely no threat to either man. Dutch, however, clearly demonstrating more of the unhinged behavior that the gang witnessed in Chapter 4, such as when he brutally executed Angelo Bronte, grabs Gloria by the throat and throws her up into the ladder and strangles her to death. Arthur is horrified, and Dutch claims that she was going to betray them, but Arthur sees through Dutch's lies, which only continues to fuel Arthur's growing doubts about him. Arthur and Dutch eventually continue by climbing the ladder into Fusar's compound, Aqua Dulce, with Dutch continuing to justify his actions. However, Arthur remains skeptical and asks how did Dutch know that Gloria was going to betray them. Dutch mentions something about seeing something in her eyes and the way she was leading them. However, Arthur points out how Dutch previously mentioned how he knew Spanish, therefore demonstrating to Dutch that he clearly sees through his lies. Arthur then outright asks Dutch if he is going to strangle him next. Just as Dutch maintains that he's doing his best, the two men are interrupted by Fusar, Simon Levi, and Cuban soldiers who are brutally mistreating and taunting Javier, whose leg is tied to a donkey and is being dragged behind. It's here that the two men have seen enough and jump into action to rescue Javier. After sneaking around Fusar's stronghold and killing some guards, Dutch realizes that the sugar refining plant can be blown up and cause the necessary distraction they require in order to divert many of the guards' attention and free Javier. Dutch and Arthur sabotage the refinery and get into position outside just before it blows up. When the refinery blows up, several of the guards leave the area where Javier is imprisoned and run to the refinery. Dutch sees their opportunity and runs forward to Javier. Arthur provides cover and takes out many soldiers as Dutch frees Javier from a cage. Dutch then leads the way with Javier as Arthur continues to provide cover, They eventually make their way out of Agua Dulce, through a sugar field, and down towards the Arroyo de la Vibora, where Arthur takes out the rest of the soldiers, while Dutch escapes with Javier. Arthur then makes his way towards Cinco Torres, the old abandoned fort, to meet up with Hercule, Dutch, and the gang. In Hell Hath No Fury, Arthur meets up with Dutch and the gang, as well as Hercule, at Cinco Torres, the old abandoned fort that both the rebels and Hercule use as a hideout. As Arthur enters the interior of the fort, Dutch is pointing out to Hercule that they've done what he's asked, while Hercule promised them a boat in order to leave the island. However, Hercule points out that not only is Fusar gunning hard for Arthur, Dutch, and the rest, seeing as Hercule reveals that Fusar knows who they are and that there's a big price on their heads in the US, but also that if they help Hercule take out Fusar, he can help them escape before anyone from the US arrives to take the gang into custody. Furthermore, Hercule also informs the gang that Fusar has requested the assistance of the Cuban Navy, so even if the gang suddenly had access to a boat, they wouldn't be able to escape. And judging by the way they're watching and listening to him, the gang knows that Hercule is correct and being honest, and therefore they respect him. After all, Hercule did rescue them on the beach. A rebel suddenly enters and repeatedly calls to Hercule to quickly follow him, and the gang follow him up the stairs and outside in order to see what the commotion is about. A Cuban warship has arrived, in addition to dozens of soldiers. As the men are ready to fight, Hercule points out that he will prepare a cannon. Arthur, Bill, Dutch, Micah, and the rebel accompanying Hercule fight off the waves of Cuban soldiers. Their determination was not only relentless, but which gave them a clear advantage in this epic shootout. Dutch and Bill in particular demonstrate their experience in battle, as Bill consistently emphasizes just how many enemies there are, and therefore not letting his guard down for a second, while Dutch is very strategic, emphasizing the need to make a stand on the beach so Arthur and Hercule can get to the cannon and attack the warship. Arthur and Hercule reach the cannon, and Arthur continually blasts the warship while Hercule reloads. Bill keeps encouraging Arthur and gets more excited as it appears the fight is turning in their favor. The warship finally begins to sink and the gang prevails. After a brief moment enjoying their victory, the men continue on back down to the beach and to Dutch. Hercule confirms he has arranged a boat for the gang, which can now safely dock with the warship destroyed. Dutch tells Micah to meet up with the captain of the boat in order to make arrangements for their escape, and he also asks Bill to assist him with a wounded Javier. From here, the men can press on to the dock and ultimately their escape from Guarma. At the conclusion of Hell Hath No Fury, the next mission you're locked into playing, Paradise Mercifully Departed, begins immediately. As Arthur arrives at the dock from Cinco Torres, Micah is also returning, but he has bad news. The captain of the boat they were meant to escape on was apprehended by the Cuban military and is being held under heavy guard. In addition, Fusar has cannons positioned strategically in order to prevent their escape by boat. Dutch has Bill guard Javier and the boat, while the men spring into action. Arthur and Micah sneak behind an artillery post, stealth kill the 2 soldiers, and destroy the cannons with dynamite. Countless Cuban soldiers immediately arrive, but Arthur leads the fight, taking out one after another. Hercule directs the men to a second artillery post, which is again destroyed by dynamite as Arthur and Dutch fight off more soldiers. After destroying the cannons, Micah tells the men that the captain is being held in the workers' compound, and he leads the way. Arthur, however, presses forward, killing several more Cuban soldiers until he reaches the cabin in which the captain is being held. However, upon entering, Arthur is ambushed by Levi Simon, but shortly behind is Dutch, who handles the situation masterfully by putting both Levi Simon and eventually Fusar, who also shows up, in their place.
We are all bastards, my friend, but only one of us is some would-be emperor's whore.
We know who you are.
And nobody knows who you are. Not even your goddamn father.
You maggots are going to die.
Dutch tips Arthur off to kick the rifle on the floor towards the captain, who quickly shoots and kills Levi Simon. But Fusar is able to escape. The men survived a tense standoff, but are not out of danger yet, as they must make it back to the boat and escape the island. The men press forward towards the beach, with Arthur leading the way once more, taking out more Cuban soldiers until they're confronted once again by Fusar, who has taken up position in a small tower that has a cannon. But Hercule directs Arthur to a cannon positioned below Fusar, and Arthur promptly and finally kills Fusar, and the men are finally able to make it back to the boat. With the gang heading back to the US and Hercule back to Haiti, the men bid their farewells, and Dutch thanks Hercule for his help, and he sees just how honest and genuine Hercule was. From here, the gang makes its way back to the United States, with each man departing separately at a different port. Nonetheless, at this point in the game or story, more or less about halfway through Chapter 5, you will still be locked into playing the next 2 missions which take place in the US. While certainly it was not particularly user or customer friendly, locking you into playing 5 missions in a row, which seems very rash, rushed, and even lazy. Nonetheless, I do have to emphasize that these missions on Guarma were really fun and thoroughly enjoyable. There is not only non-stop action, with particularly large and even epic shootouts, but what I really enjoyed and appreciated was the unity and cooperation of the gang, not only between themselves, but also with Hercule, the rebels, and workers. The gang found themselves in the midst of a disaster and crisis, with Arthur clearly calling Dutch's leadership and sanity into question. But with the reality of their situation, facing imminent death at the hands of arguably the greatest evil the gang has ever encountered, in Colonel Alberto Fusar, they all came together and united in order to survive and to live to fight another day. Dutch is very strategic and proves himself to be very tactical in shootouts or even combat situations. Not only could you see that the gang respected Hercule, but I also love the camaraderie between Arthur and Bill during Hell Hath No Fury, and just how cooperative and collaborative Micah was in Guarma. There's no attitude, snark, antagonizing, or boastful behavior from him. For once, Micah isn't annoying or toxic. He just wants to escape and survive like the rest of the gang, and for once he behaves like a reliable and trustworthy ally. But of course, Micah's newfound behavior and outlook on Guarma doesn't last once the gang returns to the US. Regardless, this was very refreshing and really the last real unified stand of the gang before its very fast and inevitable collapse in Chapter 6. The inclusion of Guarma in Chapter 5 was really to showcase, at least thematically and narratively, the brutal realities of imperialism and colonialism. The most repulsive violence of the American frontier occurred just around the time imperial and colonial development was skyrocketing. This would include not only the division of Africa by the major European imperialist powers, but also the barbaric crimes committed against the nationalities of the small Atlantic and Pacific Islands. And in Red Dead Redemption 2, this is apparently committed by a reactionary and despotic Cuban military who are kidnapping and forcing inhabitants of various islands surrounding Guarma to become slave laborers in the sugar plantations on that island. And just as a side note, it's not exactly clear if Fusar and the Cuban military are actually Cuban or Spanish. During this time in the late 1890s, Cuba fought a war of independence against Spain and ultimately won its independence in 1902. Regardless, Dutch believed that the gang could escape civilization and specifically law enforcement, which carried out the interests of the American ruling class, such as with Leviticus Cornwall, who really is reminiscent of a 19th century robber baron. But Dutch was right, in that they did escape civilization and the law when they set sail from Saint Denis. However, what the Vanderlyn gang could not escape were the brutal realities of international capital and capitalism. A global system marked by brutal violence, exploitation, and extraction. There are those who feel that Guarma simply did not fit with the game's overall story, nor did Guarma add anything to it, and was an unnecessary sidetracking of the main story. That despite showcasing more of Dutch's mental decline, that the inclusion of this tropical island excursion was just too jarring and piggybacked on. Some even suggest that it would have fit the game and story much better if a chapter was spent in Mexico instead. I do see a lot of merit and solid points in these criticisms. But despite being locked into 5 missions in a row and not being able to explore the island and having a proper free roam included, I did really enjoy the missions and the gang's last unified stand. Certainly being locked into playing 5 missions in a row and having no free roam for Guarma was very disappointing. Furthermore, this disappointment is validated when you consider that Rockstar Games did indeed have much bigger plans for Guarma, with data miners discovering all sorts of cut content for the tropical island. In the very small village, just west of Agua Dulce and north of La Capilla, the church ruins where you rescue the workers in the mission Savagery Unleashed, there was supposed to be a saloon an empty hut, and a general store. These few amenities would have been very welcome and appreciated. I can't understand why these were cut, nor what the rationale would be for cutting them. It would have been so simple and easy to include these in Guarma in Chapter 5. While I couldn't credit the previous post from Red Dead Redemption Mysteries Reddit, due to the person apparently deleting their account, this next post is credited to Red Dead Russ, who went out of their way to share this discovery, which Red Dead Russ credited to Dan and Rolls-Cha2282. Guarma was indeed supposed to feature a stranger as well, who would have provided missions for the player to complete. Andreas Coulon would have provided 5 missions for Arthur Morgan, or the player to complete. Coulon also would have provided Arthur with a treasure map. While in one encounter with Coulon, he would have been drunk, but he also may have been an opium user as well, as Coulon's opium pipe was also discovered in the game files. Coulon's character model apparently went on to serve as the template for Leviticus Cornwall. Now, these few examples are merely the tip of the proverbial iceberg in terms of Guarma's cut content. There's much more out there that you can check out. Nonetheless, the question must be asked and answered. Why was Guarma so disappointing in Chapter 5? Why was our time on the island so constrained and rushed? Why couldn't we explore the island and have a proper free roam? Why wasn't there a settlement with amenities, a stranger with missions, and more? The answer to this question is actually rather on the logistical side of Rockstar Games' development process, in which fault specifically can be found with their managerial leadership. Rockstar Games has a serious project management problem. Red Dead Redemption 2 took Rockstar Games a mind-blowing 8 years to complete, despite thousands of developers and many studios around the world. More recently, Rockstar Games have had GTA 6 in development probably since 2018, when they completed development for Red Dead Redemption 2. Since likely beginning development for GTA 6 in 2018, Rockstar have not only reassigned every studio to work on the new game, just like they did with Red Dead Redemption 2, but also reassigned the entire Red Dead Online team to assist with GTA 6's development. In fact, other than a few large DLCs, such as the Cayo Perico heist, Rockstar Games can't even properly maintain 2 live service games, GTA Online and Red Dead Online, while working on one new game, GTA 6. This is despite approximately now 5,000 developers and 11 studios around the world. To put this in perspective, Red Dead Online hasn't had a new DLC since July 2021, and now only receives monthly bonuses and a new Telegram mission once a year, and the occasional bug patch. GTA Online, meanwhile, has had a few massive DLCs, but predominantly receives new missions, vehicles, cosmetics, and quality of life improvements. Again, This is despite somewhere approximately close to 5,000 developers and 11 studios around the world. Plus, Red Dead Redemption 2 still hasn't received a next-generation edition, despite being the 7th best-selling video game of all time. Despite 8 years and all of their vast resources, Rockstar Games simply fumbled the proverbial ball when it came to Guarma, and the result was a clear disappointment. While certainly the missions on the tropical island were very fun and engaging, featuring epic shootouts and well-crafted antagonists, the inclusion of Guarma fell short due to a complete lack of a proper free roam, a settlement, and other immersion features. And of course, being both rushed and locked into playing 5 missions in a row without being able to regain control of Arthur Morgan and not having the freedom to explore. In fact, you couldn't even craft or cook at the gang's temporary camp. Although Red Dead Redemption 2 is an utter masterpiece, it's a shame it has a few considerable disappointments, simply because Rockstar Games can't seem to improve their project management.